Once the communist has been recruited and trained, he then proceeds with his mature communist activity. What does this activity primarily embrace? Most communists spend little or no time advancing the arguments of communism with the idea of recruiting other people to communism. This is not the primary activity of a mature communist. Communism comes to power basically in 5 steps. These 5 steps are: 1, the recruitment of the communists, primarily student intellectuals in colleges and universities. 2, the training of these communists so that they'll be competent, skilled, dedicated operatives within the communist movement. 3, the scientific exploitation of group motivations by these communists to advance the Communist Party in popularity and power. 4 is the seizure of power. 5 is the consolidation of power, the establishment of communist dictatorship, the seizure of total communist monopoly, and the enslavement of the entire population. Once the communist is recruited and trained, he considers himself a scientist who can use effectively the existing forces operating within his community and nation. Every communist in the world claims to be a scientist, a practitioner of the science of Marxism-Leninism. This science of the communists is the technique of using groups of people in terms of their own needs and desires and ambitions and grievances, so that they unconsciously advance the communist purposes. In the concept of science the communists have, a scientist is one who can take a force and make it serve him. Existing forces multiply the power of the individual many times. The ancient Greek scientist Archimedes, referring to the lever, said, give me a lever long enough and somewhere to stand, and I will move the world. The scientist can take a force and make it operate against itself. For example, the nautical scientist or the sailor can take the wind and make it drive a boat against itself. So the communist can take the winds of human freedom, the forces operating within society which desire greater personal liberty, and use them to lead mankind to dictatorship and slavery. The way the communists do this is to investigate every community and to determine the forces operating within it. This can be summarized by saying, find out what people want, promise it to them, go to work to get it for them so that you can come to power over them. So communism never approaches the people or the masses, to use their own 2 terms, in terms of communist doctrine. They always approach them in terms of their own basic self-interest. As we survey communist history, we find that the communists have used forces which are basic to human nature skillfully indeed, so that they could establish their own power. The fact that these desires of the people contradict the objectives of communism is to them immaterial, provided these desires and forces can be used to establish communist dictatorship. Once communist dictatorship is established, the communists know they can enforce their will upon these people. If we survey the forces that have been used historically to advance communism to power, we find a very strange paradox. The force that they have used most effectively is one which is absolutely contradictory to the basic communist objective. The basic communist objective is the abolition of private property. In the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx says our objective can be stated in one sentence: abolition of private property. And yet the force that the communists have used to establish themselves in a position to destroy private property has been the almost universal desire within human nature to own private property. And by exploiting the desire to own private property, the communists have established their power to destroy private property. Let's examine how they came to power in Russia. Their slogan in Russia was bread, peace, and land. They promised the people ownership of land, private property in land. Why did they do this? Communist doctrine taught that private ownership of land was something that must be abolished. But the communists wanted the masses to follow them. If the masses were to follow them, to enable them to overcome the established power and establish their own dictatorship, they must be following them for something that was important to their way of thinking. Nothing was more important to the Russian peasant than to own his own plot of land, to work on it, to own the products that it produced. So the communist program was own your own land, distribution of land. So behind the slogan of ownership of private property, the Communist Party established power within Russia and ultimately abolished private property. In 1917, during the phase of coming to power, they distributed land to the peasants. It was not until 1928, when they had consolidated communist power within the cities and built the necessary weapons, that they felt themselves strong enough to deprive the peasantry of the land which they had distributed in 1917. We find a very similar situation in China. The people were promised land. Own your own land was the great slogan. Mao Zedong and the communists were land reformers, and they were. Many people who did not understand this technique of communist operation, how the communists work, and assume that the communists are always advancing publicly the ultimate communist objective, when they observed the way Mao Zedong and his communists were land reformers distributing land, they said, these people can't be communists because the communists are advocating state ownership of land. These people are distributing individual ownership of land, therefore they are not communists. It shows how ignorance of the dynamics, the techniques, the methods of communism can be most deceptive and play right into the communist hands, because the science of Marxism-Leninism teaches them that they must utilize any force so that they can use it to advance communism to power. So any program that will advance communist power is a good program. This program can, of course, be merely temporary, because once the communists are in power, they will then be able to forcibly impose the program that they desire. The force that the communists have used with considerable effectiveness throughout the world is the force of nationalism, the force of racism. Once again, we find that abolition of nationalism and abolition of racism is one of the final communist objectives. Karl Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, says the working class have no country. Nevertheless, overwhelmingly, the people in every country are passionately devoted to their own country, their own nation, its well-being, its advancement, its liberation. So if you want to marshal the people to overthrow the established government. It's no use going to them and asking them to do it in terms of communist doctrine, but it's in terms of national liberation that the appeal is made. So we see in Vietnam, the forces are not crying out for communism, they're crying out for national liberation. It's the National Liberation Front. And during this phase, the voice of communism is frequently muted and silent. So everywhere throughout the world today, we find the communists are the supranationalists who are exploiting the universal nationalism within human nature and harnessing it to the objective of the establishment of communist power. Many other forces are thus being used by the communists. One force is the universal desire of mankind for peace. The communists know that the vast majority of the people of the world want peace. Therefore, they establish peace movements, peace fronts. The objective is to use these movements to destroy the established authority of the governments which are non-communist so that they can come to power. But nevertheless, they recruit the people in terms of their high ideals and their desire for peace. The communists are not even hypocritical in this, because to them peace is synonymous with communist victory. Since their doctrine teaches them that class war is a universal, that we are at war now, that capitalism generates war, as long as capitalism continues there must be war. Therefore, peace, true peace, is only possible when communism triumphs. So by definition, peace is identical with communist victory. Therefore, every act that advances communist victory is a peaceful act. So if they shoot you, they take a peaceful gun and they put a peaceful bullet in your warlike brain, they give you a peaceful death, and they bury you in a peaceful grave. In South Vietnam, when the communist forces go around massacring the leaders in the villages and staging an aggressive assault, this is peaceful activity because to them it is designed to advance the cause of communism. The communists can use the term peace with total sincerity in their sense. We interpret it in our sense, and we become victims not of communist duplicity, but of our own ignorance. Communism is the science of the exploitation of self-interest and ignorance.